So here I have a simple boilerplate React application, and we're going to add Redux to this application. The first thing I'm going to do is just going to create a layout. I'm going to go ahead and create the counter, the layout that we saw earlier. So for that, I'm going to create my components folder and create a couple of components. I'm going to go ahead, create a new folder. I'm going to call it components. And in this, first of all, I'm going to create a card body component, card body.js. What is this component? This component is just going to be a simple presentational or a functional component. It is just going to have the layout, the buttons, and the text. That's all this is going to have. So I'm going to go ahead and, first of all, import statement from React. And then I'm going to go ahead and create my function component. I'm going to call it const card body. It's going to receive some props. We'll take a look at that later. I'm just going to return some JSX. For now, I'll just create a fragment. I need to export this component. Let's go ahead and format this. I'm going to close this for now. So this is my card body simple component. Over here, I'll add some JSX. So I'm using Bootstrap in my public folder. I have already added, if you look at my public folder in my index.js, I have added the CSS style sheet for Bootstrap. So this way I can use some of the Bootstrap classes. I'm going to create a div, start with a div, and then I'm going to use the Bootstrap card body class. Card body. I'm using this so that it kind of looks visually pleasing. That's the only reason I'm using Bootstrap over here. Otherwise, this example can be done without any UI as well. I'll say card text, card text, and this is going to have my click counter. Let me put this in the same line. I'll say click count. I'm going to use properties over here. For now, we'll just keep it empty. This will say my click count, and then I need 2 buttons. So I'll go ahead and create 2 buttons over here. My first button, let's use the blue color of that comes from Bootstrap. So I'll say button and button primary. For this one, I will call it increment. This will be our increment button. Similarly, we're going to have our decrement button, and I'll make it red. So the class for that in Bootstrap is danger, and I'll call it decrement. Let's go ahead and format this. So this is my click count, and this is my button. For now, it shouldn't be doing anything. So let's go ahead and import this into our app so that we can actually see how this looks like. So this is just a function component. This won't have any logic inside it. For my logic and for all my Redux and everything, I'm going to create a separate component, and I'll call it counter component. This is the component that is going to have all the logic, Redux, and everything that is going on. This component is going to be the parent component of the card body. I'm just separating out the UI features from where the actual work is being done so that we don't have a lot of code and we can clearly see what is going on. So I'm going to create this counter component as well, and you will see how this comes together. I'm going to React. Okay, now remember our counter component, if we are not using Redux, requires a state because something on the screen is changing. The counter is going up and down This means our component needs state. When we talk about state, we generally need a class component. But right now, since we'll be using Redux, we don't need state. The state should not belong to any component anymore. Redux store is where all the state is going to reside. So that's why we don't need any more class components over here. We can make use of function component and create our component. Again, previously we would have needed class component because that is the one that is going to have the state. The state is now not going to reside in any component. Instead, it will be stored somewhere globally. We'll take a look at where. So that's why I'm going to stick to my function component syntax, and I'm going to create a function component instead of creating a class component. I'm going to say export default counter. This is going to return some JSX. It is eventually going to receive some properties as well. So let's go ahead and create and call our card body class over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import card body. Okay, and I'll just create a div over here. I think okay, that's better. I'm going to create a div, and I'm going to use the bootstrap class card, and then I'll make it center so that it shows up in the center. Within my class, I'll create another div, and in this div, I will just put a heading saying click counter. Okay, this is the name of my app. So this should show up on the top. So I'll just add some CSS to it so it kind of looks nicer like we saw earlier. So I'll say card header, make it blue. So I'll use the primary, and I'll say the text should be white. So it's going to be blue background with white text. And then with that, I will call my card body, which will have the buttons and all that stuff. So I think this should be good start. Let's go ahead and format this document and see how it shows up on the screen. So I'll go in my app component. I'm going to import my counter component. I don't need to import my card body because app does not need card body. The hierarchy is, my component hierarchy is, I have my app component, which has a counter component, and my counter component has my card body. Again, I just created card body to separate out some of the UI stuff over here, but you can copy this code over here as well. It's just going to be a lot more code. That's the only reason. I'm going to come over here, and right now I'll just simply say counter. We can change this later on. We'll have to change this code anyway. So I'm going to format this code, and there is my click counter. Kind of looks nice. There's my click. Doesn't really do anything, but that's how you're kind of getting there. Some of the things over here, let's go ahead and add some space. It kind of looks nicer. I'll just add some space here. See if that works. Okay, so there's some space over here. There's my button. Looks good. Let's see if I can. Maybe I'm missing the class to center this. Let's make sure. Okay, so I do have a typo over here, so that's why it's not centered. This should work. Okay, there you go. So my UI kind of looks similar now, what we were discussing. So I'm going to go ahead and start with this now. So this is my UI, and it doesn't really do anything right now, but we'll go ahead and fix that. So the next step is the first thing when we have to do a Redux application, the first thing we need to do is import the Redux libraries. So at the bottom, you will see what we need to do. Let me clear this. We need to install npm I or npm install. We need to install Redux. Okay, we need to import a Redux, and then we also need to import React Redux. You can do this in two different lines as well. This is a shorter way. This is going to go ahead and install Redux and React Redux libraries in our project. Again, this is important. If you don't have these libraries, you will not be able to create a Redux application. Once this gets installed, we'll go ahead and start coding our Redux application. So the first step, remember the three principles: store, reducer, and actions. So the first thing we are going to do is we're going to go ahead and install our reducer. Oh, create our store. That's the first step. So let's go ahead and create our store. How do we create our store? I'm going to go to my app.js. And the first thing we are going to do is we're going to import the create store function. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and say import from this method belongs to Redux. So I'm going to import it from Redux, and the function is called create store. So we'll go ahead and import this. This function is going to help us in creating the store. So let's go ahead and create our store. How do we create our store? We can simply say the function will create our, I'll call it store. And then I'm going to call the function that we just did, that we just imported. This is how you create a store in Redux. That's it. It's not complete. We are still missing something. We are missing an argument that goes with the store. That is our second step. The second step is we need to create a reducer. The first step, we are done. We created a store. The second step is we are going to create a reducer. Remember, what is a reducer? A reducer is a function that gets a state and returns an updated or new state based on some actions. So basically, a reducer is a function. So let's go ahead and create a function. I'm going to call it reducer. You can call it anything you want. And this is my arrow function syntax. There's my reducer. So this reducer function that we created is an argument inside the store. Let me move this down. I'll keep my store. Even though JavaScript doesn't really care, it should still work. But just for readability purposes, I move my declaration on the top. Now this reducer function is not complete. We'll go ahead and complete it. It is missing some arguments. It doesn't have anything in the body, but this is a reducer function. This is the second step. Now, when you create the store, the argument that you are going to pass is this reducer function. So first step, create a store. Second step, create a reducer function. And then you're going to pass this reducer function as an argument to the create store method, which we just imported from the Redux library. Now, let's go ahead and complete our method, our function signature for reducer. Now, reducer takes in two things. It takes in the current state. So I'm going to call that variable state. And then the second thing it takes as an argument is the action. Based on the action, it is going to go ahead and update the state. Now, it is recommended that, remember in React, when we create a state, we give it an initial value. If you don't give the initial value, you're going to see it is going to give you a exception. It is going to throw an error saying the state is null, because the first time your code runs, the state is always going to be null. So just for that, what we do is we create our initial state object, initial state. Okay, just like any state variable. Since state is an object, that's why we created an object. And then remember within the state, we have different variables that are part of the state. So in this case, let's call our state variable as count. And we'll set it to initial value as 0. Okay, just like you create a state. Now in my reducer, I'm going to say, well, if the state is null, go ahead and use assign this initial state. This is the syntax in JavaScript, which says if any variable, if the argument is null, this is the argument, this is the value that takes precedence. So the first time when my code runs, my state is going to be null. If it is null, JavaScript is going to set it as initial state, which is an object which contains my state variable count. Okay, so this is the preferred syntax for when it comes to Redux, so that when you create a reducer, make sure you give some kind of initial state. Otherwise, you're going to see some null exceptions. Okay, so we did our store, we did our reducer. We're still missing something over here. That would be that what should happen when something, when my state is updating. Okay, so we'll come back to that. Let's go ahead and look at our third component, which is actions. Like how do we dispatch actions? How do we handle those actions? What do we do with it? So the next part, we are going to switch over to our counter component. We need to modify this counter component. The first thing we need to do is we need to connect this component to Redux. Okay, any component that we're working with, when it comes to Redux, you need to tell Redux that, hey, this is the component that you need to take care of. You need to look at this component. Whenever something happens, this is under your control. Okay, now how do we give the control to Redux for our component? There is a method, there is a function in Redux called connect. So that's what we will do. We are going to use our connect function, and we are going to give this component, and so that it comes under Redux's control, and whenever something happens, this Redux knows which component to talk to. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to import, and this connect function actually is part of React Redux library that we just installed. Okay, and the function is connect. Now, the connect function actually takes arguments. Typically takes 4 arguments, but all of them are optional. You don't have to pass anything to it. Okay, the return type for the connect function is another component. Basically, the connect function over here is a higher order component. Remember, higher order component takes in another component and then returns a component. So the connect function over here is going to return you another component, and that's what we need to use. Okay, now how do we use the connect function at the bottom? There are a couple of ways you can do it. First, I will show you a simple way so that you can understand what is going on, and then I will do it in a single line. So I'm going to call a connect function, and the connect function is going to return us a wrapper. So I'm going to say const, and I will say connect counter. I'm going to call this variable, and then I'm going to call my connect function. Okay, this is the first thing. Now, remember, as I mentioned, connect has options for 4 arguments, but all of them are optional. You don't have to give anything, or you can use all 4. In this case, we're going to look at the more important one, which is called map state to props. We'll talk about it in a minute, but for now, let's keep it empty. Okay, now, once you are done with this, you are going to connect this. This goes ahead and connects, lets Redux know that my counter component, that this component is eventually going to be connected. It's not complete. We still need to do one more thing, and then it is going to be completely under Redux's control. What do we do? The wrapper that is returned from Redux, this is a higher order component as well. So since this is a higher order component, we need to go ahead and give our counter component to it so that it goes ahead, adds some new features, whatever the Redux properties are, adds them to our counter component. Now, how do we do that? Remember, when we talk about higher order components, we simply do this thing. So this is going to return a counter variable. This is going to return a counter component that is completely connected to Redux. Okay, and what we can do is we can say const counter, let's say Redux counter. Okay, so two steps. Connect method, going to return a wrapper, HOC or higher order component. The higher order component, you're going to pass your component, which is called counter, and then it is going to return us the Redux counter, another HOC. This is the one that is now under Redux's control. And we are going to go ahead and export Redux counter instead of the counter variable. Okay, so this is how the higher order components work. And one of the examples of higher order component is Redux. Redux uses higher order component to connect the component. Now, this, as you can see, is done in 2 lines. Generally, when you look at the code, we don't do it in do this way. We don't use 2 separate lines or 2 separate constant variables. Simply, what we do is we can do this in a single line. And generally, what you will see people doing is this thing. We'll still will keep our counter variable. Simply, what we will do is we will say we'll first call our connect method. We'll keep it empty. Okay, the return type is going to be a wrapper component, and the wrapper component is going to take an argument, which is going to be our component. So this is how generally you will see. So now our component is connected to Redux. So these 2 lines can be done in a single line. You export this, eventually it is going to export this variable over here, but we have done it without creating a new variable. Generally, this is the preferred way, and this is what you're going to see in Redux applications. Okay, now let's go ahead and move on. Let's go to our card body over here. Okay, now card body component has 2 buttons, right? When you press increment, some action should happen. Okay, when you press decrement, another action should happen. So this means that our buttons require the on-click functionality. Okay, so let's go ahead and add the on-click functionality over here. So we'll say over here, I'm going to add the event on click. Okay, we'll keep it empty. It's going to do something, I don't know what. It's going to call a function, right? So I'm going to do the same thing over here, on click something. So now this is a function component. This is just the UI. We don't want it to have any methods. We don't need to have logic. All the logic is going to reside in the parent component over here, and that is going to have all the handle click events. So I'm going to create events over here, and then I'm going to pass this to the card body as properties, correct? So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to create 2 methods over here. I'll say um, const, I'll say const handle increment. This is going to be one method, and then I'll call another method, and this time I'll call it handle decrement. Okay, so these are my 2 methods that are going to eventually do something. Right now they're empty. As you can see, the body of these functions is empty, and we'll do something when it comes to this. So let's go ahead and fix that. So these are the 2 functions that should be called from my card body. Okay, now how do I tell card body that these are the functions that you need to call? I need to pass these functions as properties. I'm going to go ahead and say handle increment property, and I'm going to pass this method handle increment. Okay, similarly, I'll create another property handle decrement, and I'm going to pass in this function handle decrement to the card body. Okay, now my card body is going to receive 2 properties, handle increment and handle decrement, and I can then use it in my click function. So I'm going to come back over here. I'm going to add the props variable. Okay, my props is going to come over here, and I will say props dot handle increment. Okay, and this is going to be props dot handle decrement. Okay, so this component is pretty much good. Um, The only thing missing over here is this click count over here. You see this click count? It is going to be empty. So we need to pass this count. Where is the count going to come from? The count is also going to come from my counter component because that's the parent component. Everything is being passed down to card body. Card body is just a UI presentational functional component that has no logic built inside it. So um, I want the counter or the count variable to come from over here as well. For now, what I will do is I will just say assign one. All kind of hard coded, and then we'll go ahead and fix it. But the variable eventually is going to come from the counter component. So over here, I will just display props.count. Okay, and so my card body component is pretty much done. I don't think I have to do anything else over here. My card body is done, doesn't have any functionality. All it does is shows these three things, and whatever gets passed to it, it is going to show that. When you click this, it is going to call the functions which are over here. Okay, so card body is pretty much done. I'm going to close this out. I don't think we need this. We'll go ahead and work on our counter component. So what we did, we connected it to Redux. Okay, coming back to our app component over here. Okay, so we created our store. We have a reducer. There's one more thing we need to do over here. The other thing is Redux uses the provider functionality, which is in part of React. What provider does it sends down information or data down to its child components. Okay, so we're going to make use of that provider that comes built in into React Redux. Okay, let's take a look how it works. The first thing we are going to do is we're going to import the provider component from React Redux. Okay, it is called provider. And then provider component is going to be the parent component of all the components inside a Redux application. Okay, right now we only have a single component called counter, but later on, if you have more components, they're all going to reside inside the provider component. Okay, so I'm going to create a provider component, which we just imported. Okay, I'm going to move this component inside. Let's go ahead and format this. Okay, so this is how it looks like. Um, Let me use the self-closing tag over here. And this is how you do the provider. So when you're creating a Redux application, make sure to import provider, and then all your components are going to be inside the provider component. Your provider is going to be the parent component for everything. Why? Provider component is going to pass down some information. What is that information or data? It is the information related to the store. The provider component is going to pass down the store to each component or each child component. And how does it do it? It does it through properties. Okay, so this is part of the basic setup of a Redux application. We created a store, we created a reducer, we imported the provider component and passed down the store to all the child components that are there. Right now, we only have a single component, and that's what happens. Okay, now coming back to our counter component, remember we talked about actions. How do we update the store? When this increment happens, when I click this increment button, the count variable should go up, and this variable in the state, if you go back over here in the store, we have this variable as the state. Okay, this variable should be updated. Okay, and how do we update the store? Remember from our previous video that the store can only be updated by dispatching actions which are handled in the reducer. So we need to dispatch some kind of actions. And what are actions? Actions are simply JavaScript objects. So we need to dispatch some kind of a action or a JavaScript object that is going to let the store know that, okay, something is being updated. Okay, where are we going to dispatch that action? We are going to dispatch when we click this button over here, increment, when we click this button, decrement over here. Okay, so this means these are the two functions where we are going to dispatch some actions. Okay, now since this component is connected to Redux, Redux gives us a simple function, gives us a function called dispatch. And how do we get that function? We get that function as inside the properties. Okay, so this counter variable is going to receive some properties. Okay, one of the properties, and this is coming from Redux because Redux has now taken over our component. One of the properties is going to be a function called dispatch. Again, remember this dispatch function is coming from Redux. Okay, what does the dispatch function do? It dispatches actions. Okay, now remember actions are JavaScript objects, so the argument is going to be an object, which is going to be an action. Okay, now before I proceed, remember we can use our object destructuring property in functionality in JavaScript. And instead of doing this, we can simply say dispatch, and you don't need to do props.dispatch. Okay, so I just used object destructuring over here. I'm going to receive a prop dispatch, and I'm going to call this function. And it looks nicer. That's why I like object destructuring. Okay, now coming back over here, we are going to dispatch an action, which is going to be a JavaScript object. Now, an action also has some properties. One of the mandatory or required property is type. Okay, what does type has? Type, you can have anything. This defines what type of an action is being dispatched. In this case, I'm going to create and I'm going to say this is an action of type increment. That's all. Okay, you can come up with your own names depending on what you're trying to do. Similarly, when the decrement happens, I'm going to dispatch an action, okay? And I'm going to say type. This time my action type is going to be decrement. I'm calling it decrement or decrement, okay? You can call it anything you want. But basically, this type is going to be unique. This identifies what is going on with our methods. Okay, so when I click over here, an action is dispatched, which is going to be of type increment. Now what happens? It comes over here to the reducer. The reducer is the one that is going to handle everything. Now right now, it doesn't do anything, but it receives the action. So it is going to receive the action, increment or decrement. Remember, this is inside the property called type. So if you want to access it, it's going to be action.type. Okay, so you're going to come over here inside a reducer. You can put a if statements, or let's go ahead and use our switch statement. We're going to say action dot type. Okay, so in this case, we are going to say if the action dot type is increment, okay, we are going to do something. We are going to do something, and if let's go ahead and create another case statement. If it is decrement. Okay, so these names over here, these properties, these string names, they should exactly match the action. If there's a typo, obviously it's not going to catch it, and then you won't be able to see anything. So the action comes over here. The action type is increment. Now, when it is increment, what do we want to do? Remember, we are returning the new or updated state. So I'm going to simply say return the new state, which is going to be an object. So I'm going to update the state, and I'm going to say state. This is the variable. This is the first argument over here. Okay. Whatever the current state is, add 1 to this counter, and then return this. Okay. When decrement action is captured, I want to return a new state. Remember, state is an object, so that's why I'm returning an object. And what does my state right now only contains one variable? So I'm going to say count. my current value of the count from the current state minus 1. Whatever the current state is, minus 1. Return that. Okay. Default, if something happens, if the state is null, or if it is something else happened, okay? If it is not increment or decrement, by mistake we pass something else, we will just return whatever the original state that came in, we'll just simply return this. Because we are not handling any other action other than increment and decrement, just as a good practice, we have a default case. If by by something we make a typo or something else happens, the action is not over here. We are still being good citizen. Instead of the application being blown up, we will simply return the original state, and this way nothing bad will happen. Okay, so again, to reiterate, we created a reducer which is going to receive the current state and an action. Based on the action, we are going to return updated or the new state. So the action is increment, goes ahead and increases the count. If it is decrement, it reduces the count and returns the new state. Okay, now this new state is going to be received by our counter variable over here. Okay, now the code that we have right now, my counter component is not going to receive the updated state. Right now, my counter component is updating the state by dispatching the actions, but it is not going to receive the new state. Okay, why does it happen? Because remember, in our connect function earlier, I mentioned it takes 4 arguments which are all optional. Okay, now if you want our state to receive the updated state, updated value of the counter, we need to pass something else as an argument to our connect function. Okay. Um, Now, the first 2 arguments are inside the connect function, which are optional, are functions. Okay, so connect actually takes other functions into as an argument. Remember, this is the definition of a higher order function. A higher order function takes another function as an input. So basically, connect is a higher order function as well. Okay, now the first argument that the connect function takes, it's called map state to props. Again, remember, this is just a function. So I'm going to create a function called map state to props. Okay, now this function takes a single argument, which is going to be the state, the current state, or the new or the updated state. Okay, so I'm going to call this argument as state. I'm going to use the arrow syntax. Okay, now this is what does, look at the name. The name says map state to props. So what it does is it is going to take the state that this component is going to receive and convert it into props. Why is that required? Because remember, we are using Redux. There is no more individual state inside a component. If there is a change, the components are going to receive the new state as props. Okay, there is no way I can use state over here. That is why intentionally I created a function component so that we don't use a state at all. Okay, so that's the reason that I cannot use state over here. This means since this is a function component, remember function component do not have the capability to use state variable unless if it's React hooks. That's a story for a different day. For now, it doesn't have the capability. If this was a class component, I would have access to state, but don't have class components because this is Redux. Redux is already taking care of the state. So what does this mean? This means if we are supposed to receive something, we are supposed to receive the updated value from the state, it has to be converted into props. Okay, now this is a function map state to props. That's what it does. It converts it into props. So what do we want it converted to? We want it to convert it to a variable called count. And what is it being, what is the value that this is going to have? It is going to have the value state dot count. Now why state dot count? Because that's what we called it over here. If this was counter, it would be state.counter. If this was simply C, it will be called state.c. Okay. Now, this function is saying it is going to map the state into a prop called count. Okay. So now my component is going to receive a variable called count. Right now, it's not receiving it. So let's go ahead and add it and say count. Now this is going to completion. My component is going to receive a property called count and a dispatch. Dispatch is coming from Redux. Why is it receiving count? Because I have a function. I'm going to give this to connect. When the connect connects our component to Redux, it is going to make sure that it sends a property called count to my variable. Okay, the last thing we need to do is we need to give this to our connect function. So I'm going to say map state to props. Okay, and that's all. Now, remember, generally by standard, we call it map state to props because it tells us exactly what we are trying to do. Again, you can call this function anything you want, okay, because this is just a function name, and then make sure that you change the name over here as well. It doesn't matter. Connect is only expecting a function which has a single argument with the state. That's all it is expecting. Obviously, you can call this anything you want, but generally, I would recommend stick to this naming convention over here because if you look at the React Redux documentation, they follow the same strategy. So we'll keep the same name over here. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this application and see if this is working. So I install these two. Let's go ahead and do an npm start. And let's go ahead and see if this application comes up. And then we will go ahead and see if the counter is working. Oh, I think I see what I didn't do. I'm still kind of hard coding over here. So let's go ahead and see. So you see this one over here. I'm kind of hard coding this one. That's why it always shows one over here. If you increment, decrement, doesn't do anything. So let's go ahead and fix that. This is going to be replaced with our property count, which is being received. So I'm going to replace it with count. Okay. When this loads up, the first time this is going to be 0. Why? Remember, we set our initial state to 0. If you set this initial state to 10, you will see the counter is going to start from 10. Okay, that's where the initial state is. If you didn't have initial state, remember initially it is null. So what will happen is you're going to see some null exceptions or null errors if you're not passing the initial state. Okay, so that looks good. Let's make it 0 again. Now if I increment, this should go up. Okay, that's good. Increment, 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 decrement, decrement, decrement. So this application is working. The only difference is we are getting this variable, the value from this variable as from the Redux store. Again, the flow is the first thing we connected. This connect function is important. This is the one, if you don't have the connect function, Redux will not connect this component to the Redux store. Okay. When you press this increment button, if you go to the card body component, remember this function, it calls the handle increment. This is being passed down as property. This means this is coming from the parent. The parent is counter. So it comes over here. It calls this handle increment button. What do? We are dispatching an action. What is an action? An action is just a object. Okay. This object has a property, mandatory property called type. Okay, so this is going to dispatch an action of type increment. Now my reducer is going to be listening to this. When the state update happens, it receives this action, and based on what action it received, it is going to go ahead and update the state. Once the state is updated, we have this map state to props. Again, remember, map state to props function tells Redux that when the state is updated, please send that updated state to this counter component. If you don't have this, again, this is optional. If you don't have this method over here, you are not going to receive this updated new count value over here. Okay, there might be some cases where you really don't need to see the new values, but generally, this is probably one of the more used functions. So that's why I have this function over here. If you don't have this function, you're not going to receive this updated value that you see on the screen. So you see 11, 12, 16, 17, 18, 19 going up. If you don't have this function, we are not going to receive this, and eventually we will not be able to show this count. Okay, so this is a simple application using Redux. Obviously, Redux is used in a lot more complex environment where we have a lot more components. But this was a simple example so that we can see what are the components, what are the things required to make a Redux application. Okay, one thing that is missing over here is if you look at my folder structure, I have a components folder, and all my Redux stuff is being done in my app.js. Generally, you will see in production level applications, we have a separate folder structure for Redux so that we can clearly see what is happening there. In the next video, I'm just going to refactor this application. I'm going to make it look a little bit nicer. I'm going to move some code into different folders so that my app component is not as crowded as it is right now. Again, this does not change any of the functionality. We'll still be using Redux. The application is going to look exactly the same. It's going to work exactly the same. The only thing is we're going to restructure our application so that we have the required code where we want. Okay.